Senator Tim Scott, who was appointed to his South Carolina seat after Jim DeMint stepped down, was sworn in yesterday and already holds a number of firsts. He is currently the only African-American senator and the first since Illinois Senator Roland Burris left the upper chamber in 2010. Just 7 African-Americans from 4 states have ever held Senate seats, and Scott is the first black senator from the South sworn in since Reconstruction. Yes, you heard that correctly. The first black senator from the South since Mississippi Senator Blanche Bruce, a former slave, was elected in 1874. But Scott holds another distinction. He is actually the only African-American Republican in Congress. There are 42 Democrats in the House who are African-American, meaning overall 16% of Democrats in Congress are black. As for the GOP, thanks to Senator Scott, less than 0.5% of Republicans in Congress are black. Without him, of course, it would be 0%. But what does Tim Scott's appointment to the Senate mean for the Republican Party? According to the president of the NAACP, not much.
A new senator like Tim Scott is black. He gets an F on our report card every year. We have Republicans who believe in civil rights. Unfortunately, he is not one of them.
Senator Scott brushed aside that assessment last night.
Some folks really want to find a way to make race more of a part of the conversation going forward. I think that it's time for us to continue to move forward as a nation.
Perhaps the reason race is still a part of the conversation is that while African Americans make up more than 13% of this country, they represent just 0.4% of the Republican Party in Congress. Joining us now to discuss this is the New Yorker's Kela Fasane. Kay, you had a very interesting blog post, and I find it awkward and entertaining to read people their own quotes, so I'll do that right now. If Democrats believe that racial diversity is important, shouldn't they want the Republican caucus to be more diverse, too? And if Republicans want to break racial barriers, then shouldn't Scott's appointment remind them how far they have to go? If it makes sense for Republicans to be proud to have a black senator in their party, then wouldn't it also make sense for them to be bothered by the relative absence of black voters? 2 very astute points. Let's talk about the latter first, which is the notion that somehow Tim Scott changes the Republican Party in some grand way.
As much as a senator can. I mean, I think there's something strange about. I understand why liberals would be skeptical about the arrival of a conservative African-American senator, but as I say in that quote, I think if you believe that diversity is important, I imagine you'd want conservatives to be racially diverse as well as liberals. I think though it does make sense to talk also about black voters. In other words, it's one thing to say, okay, there are black politicians in the Republican Party. I think it's a separate question to say, does the Republican Party attract black voters? And the
answer to that question is no.
Well, what we have now is essentially a segregated political system when it comes to African American voters and white voters. And I'm not sure that necessarily serves the interests of black voters or serves the interests of the country.
Well, I would think that it wouldn't, right? You wouldn't want to have different parties just representing different ethnic enclaves. I mean, Janelle, you look at the numbers among black voters who supported President Obama, it's like 90, it's in the high 80s, 90%. So the question is, does the presence of a Tim Scott warm the hearts of African American voters, or does it you look at Ben Jealous and it seems to be complete dismissal that this somehow is a step forward for the Republicans?
I think when we think about these things, it's really essential that we not play a game of optics. Tim Scott is African American, but the question is, what are his positions? And his policy positions have not been particularly friendly to a number of issues that might be of deep concern to black voters. On the other hand, certainly this idea that African Americans are not benefiting from being such a notoriously loyal constituency for Democrats is real if you look at Obama's first term, certainly.
To that point about Tim Scott's record, the NAACP scored him with an F, and he opposed 19 of the 20 NAACP priorities, including voting against the Pigford settlement, which of course wanted to halt payments to black farmers who were discriminated against, and he supports, among other things, vouchers, which in some ways disproportionately hurt minority students.
Well, except that there are, if we go to school vouchers and school choice, it gets real confusing when it comes to the NAACP and black voters who often find themselves on different sides of that issue. I think part of what was important about the piece is it does suggest that there's at least 2 different ways to think about diversity that I think are critical within a democracy. One is about demographic diversity. It is about optics. And the other is about substantive contestation within a party, which might also fall along along racial lines. And I think we do want to indicate that the optic and the kind of biological, essential nature of race is not real, right? There is no blackness that comes through blood. If I give you a blood transfusion, you don't become black as a result. But the fact is, it does matter to not have lily white parties. It is bad for us to have a lily white Supreme Court or a lily white Senate, right? I mean, it matters to actually have black and brown bodies. At the same time, and so not this or that, but at the same time, it also matters to have representatives who are both effective and tied into the interests of communities. But those communities are diverse. There is not one set of black interests. And what we see in terms of voting behavior tends to dampen an awful lot of contestation going on within communities because the vote is such a blunt instrument. And so all the support for President Obama, back it up a few years. George W. Bush, before he fails at Katrina, is actually beginning to erode the support of African Americans for the Democratic Party. This is not necessarily a durable reality for all of time. This is the first black president running and then running for re-election, right? I think we have to pause a little bit about the assumption about where black voters are.
And the cool thing about Tim Scott is because it's an elected position, right? In the future, because it's not a Supreme Court position or Secretary of State. It's not just in theory. He has a chance to win black votes or not win black votes.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I think and the extent to which this was something Bush and Karl Rove spent tons of time thinking about is a real, and particularly with black votes, but also with Hispanic votes, was a failure. But I mean, Tim Scott is partly the product of a party that from the top down was saying, not just to the national party, but to the state parties, to the county parties, you got to promote, if you've got 3 candidates who are equally qualified and one of them is black, lean that way. And Scott was in the South Carolina Republican Party has a tradition of real explicit racism in certain ways. Yeah. Did push Scott to the front. And its voters pushed Nikki Haley to the front. I mean, I think there is a sense among Republican leadership that this is something they need to get right.
But Ben, this is what's brilliant is the idea that there is such a powerful affirmative action of the most sort of base level quota kind that occurs,
one out of
that occurs in the GOP in the sense of
that's
black and brown.
Right, there's no more explicit affirmative action than the Republican Party. That's totally true.
Well, and let's not forget that Louis Gohmert suggested Allen West as Speaker of the House yesterday. Let us play a choice clip of Allen West appropriating the language of slaves and slavery and the legacy of Harriet Tubman.
You have this 21st century plantation that has been out there where the Democrat Party has forever taken the black vote for granted. So I'm here as the modern day Harriet Tubman to kind of lead people on the Underground Railroad away from that plantation into a sense of sensibility.
Now, when you hear that from Allen West, and who later goes on to confer the title of plantation owner to Maxine Waters, which if I were Maxine Waters would have been reason enough to probably commit some sort of, I don't want to suggest anything. Anyway, the point is, highly offensive. Highly offensive. The legacy of slavery is obviously very weighted in this country. And then to have Allen West out there, my question is the Republican Party trying to ameliorate its image among black voters? That would seem to push them away. That, to me, I don't know. I ask you guys, does that not push one away from a party when you hear
look, black and brown high-level either appointees or elected officials within the Republican Party do not bring black and brown voters. They bring white voters.
Right.
Because people don't want to be racist. When President George W. Bush says that the worst moment of his presidency is Kanye West saying that he doesn't like black people, I take him at his word at that, that he in fact really hated the idea of being labeled racist. And so no one wants to be in a party that appears so much on its face to be so clearly all white. And so when you have black and brown folks, then you can say, well, we're not racist. We've got Tim Scott. Not to get black voters, but to get white voters who, of course, reasonably do not want to be part of a racist party.
But that will always be met with skepticism, especially among African Americans, until and unless you attract African American voters. And I'm not saying that to prejudge the policies. I'm not saying that you have to adopt policy X or policy Y to attract African American voters. But if you're not attracting African American voters, of course there's going to be skepticism.
And policy is how you do this. Look at immigration. There's this law and order strand of conservatism that says, you can't no amnesty. But they've decided. But there's a lot of Hispanic voters as well as officials inside the party, and they would like more, and so they're going to compromise. They're going to make vast compromises around that principle and really change the shape of their policy.
But policy is not the only way to do this. I mean, remember, this was a task that Barack Obama had to do, right? There was a point at which there was deep African American skepticism about Barack Obama in the fall of 2007, and he brings around African American voters not by proposing a raft of policies to benefit African Americans, but by connecting with those voters. So it's not just policy.
I mean, back up to Bill Clinton, who actively passes policy after policy. I mean, as much as I heard sort of you level a bit of a critique about President Obama in the first term, I mean, the fact is he was still cleaning up things that Bill Clinton, who was labeled sort of
the first black president,
labeled culturally the first black president because of his ease with a sort of set of racial tropes and his sort of Southern identity and that kind of thing. But those policies of the welfare to work changes, of the growth of the prison industrial complex, I mean, those things had enormous negative impact on African American communities who nonetheless turned out in enormous support of this president, in part because he was better than his alternative and he was performative of a certain kind of
But blackness. I will say, to Janelle's point, the president, there was more, his outreach to the black community was, I think, more pronounced at the beginning of his candidacy, probably for the reasons that you outlined. There was a lot of support for the Clintons because he was the first black president. And since then, he has walked back from, I mean, even things like the Father's Day speech that he used to give, or talking about prison reforms. There are a number of issues that you pointed out where he could be more active, and he has, and it's an ethos that is a rising tide lifts all boats, as opposed to focusing on specific boats, if you will.
That's certainly true. I think that's been a pretty consistent pattern in this administration. Of course, he does face some political challenges that others do not. As the first actual black president, he has the constant challenge of making it clear that he is a president for all Americans. What that means in terms of specific policies, this is a much broader question about whether or not voters are truly equipped and prepared to hold any number of politicians accountable for the positions they take on.
I feel like Clinton didn't pass anything that comes close to doing for what black communities what the Affordable Care Act does.
Certainly.
I mean, take all the rest as a wash. Just on that, on the signature domestic policy achievement of the first term, it simply makes an enormous difference to black communities.
This is a conversation that is totally not, one block is not long enough at all. One show is not long enough, but we have to leave it there. Coming up, while the ranks of congressional women grow strong, the same is not true for legislation that actually protects them. We will discuss the demise of the Violence Against Women Act just ahead.